mention the incredible diversity we have. And unfortunately, even if you go to the DNR's Master Angler program, it has a couple species of sucker listed, but one of the categories is red horse suckers. There's actually 6 different species of red horse suckers, and some of them have very different ecologies. So you see 3 of them have red tails, and 3 of them don't have red tails. And some of them are really common. Most of what you see in there is golden red horse, which are incredibly abundant. When they're spawning, you can see hundreds and hundreds of them in a very short span of spawning habitat. But one that actually does live in Grand Rapids and upstream also on the Grand is a state-threatened species. The river red horse is a very rare fish, on par with the sturgeon. It has the same state-threatened classification. There's only a handful of state-threatened fish. And this one only lives in the Muskegon River system, the Grand, and the St. Joe, and a very few of them in the Kalamazoo they've recently discovered. So the river red horse is a fish that requires big rivers. Sometimes it'll move into the tributaries to spawn. It eats native mollusks, and it's very sensitive to pollution and siltation, especially when that pollution and siltation kills off the native mollusks that it feeds on. So if you take a closer look, you can see a few of these different species. If you watch, there's a red tail, that's from a shorthead red horse. You can see a lot of the goldens, there's a bass mixed in there. And this fish up here is something else. Has a deep body. It's a strange looking fish that not many people see, but there are tons of them out there. You almost never catch these fish. They have a very small mouth, but they commonly get over 5 pounds. And occasionally when it's clear out, you'll see them just about 3-4 feet under the surface, maybe in schools of 100 or so, just suspended with their fins out, sucking away, feeding on plankton. And those are quillbacks. They're another species of sucker. Some people call them quillback carp suckers, but they're not a carp. They're a native sucker, and they're really one of the most abundant fish in the lower Grand. It's really phenomenal how many are there. And you can only see them this time of year for a couple of weeks when they go up to Grand Rapids to spawn. But those fish spawning in Grand Rapids are all from the lower river. They don't like the fast water for most of their life cycle. They really prefer the slower, deeper pools. I've seen them out in spring lakes, suspended feeding like that. So suckers are a really interesting group that doesn't get much attention. There's 15 species found in Michigan, possibly more because sometimes they are misidentified. There's at least 13 species in Ottawa County, including the threatened river red horse. And again, they're not just junk fish. Some of them, the one on the top right is a long-nosed sucker, and you can see that doesn't even do it justice because the males get this brilliant red stripe. And they're big fish, big, pretty fish that comes from Lake Michigan to spawn in Grand Rapids. So they don't spend a whole lot of time in Ottawa County waters of the Grand. They zip right up, they spawn, and then they leave. And when you first get them out of the water, they're this brilliant red color, and it fades almost immediately before you can even take a picture. It's only when they're actually spawning that they get that beautiful color. But they're very abundant. They're very abundant fish that really is tied into that connection to Lake Michigan. The one on the bottom there is a white sucker, and that's really the common sucker that we have. They live almost everywhere from trout streams out to Lake Michigan. And like the longnose, the white suckers, they get that breeding stripe, and they'll crowd into the tributaries. A few of them might spawn in the Grand, but mostly they go through the Grand to get into tributaries like Crockery Creek or further upstream, and they'll spawn in big groups like this. The bigger ones, usually the female, and oftentimes it'll be one female with a male on each side. That's their preference, but in this case there's a lot more males than just one female in this little gravelly area. And this is pretty typical. The same kind of areas you would expect a salmon to spawn, really nice gravelly riffles. Those gravelly riffles have lots of oxygen. It's constantly turbulent, the water's flowing through the rocks, so the eggs that fall into the cracks between the rocks basically have a constant source of aeration. And when you get siltation, you get the fine sediments coming into the river, then that'll smother the eggs of these fish. And I've seen some areas where big banks have eroded and people maybe have taken the vegetation off or walked up and down the banks a lot. In the past, it was logging. That was the big thing. And a lot of our rivers have really healed since the logging days. And some of it's been very intentional, replanting these rollways, they're called. A lot of the northern rivers have them. These rollways where they rolled the logs down, just stripped all the vegetation off, And a lot of times it's taken people to go in there and restabilize those banks to stop that constant erosion of sand, which smothers that really valuable gravel habitat that's used by all kinds of fish. Almost all the suckers use it, salmon and trout use it, and a lot of other fish too. So if you look at this fish looks a little bit like that quillback I showed you. This is actually a buffalo. And when they're small, they're really hard to tell apart from the quillbacks. We have another species that's of special concern. It's a species of greatest conservation need in the state called the black buffalo that looks a lot like this smallmouth buffalo, but they live only in a few rivers, including the Grand and also the St. Clair area. And they look a lot like another fish, so they're very easy to mistake. And sometimes people will think they're doing the environment a favor by going out and killing buffalo. But again, buffalo are a pretty rare fish, but they have kind of an identity crisis. They look a lot like the common carp, which is an invasive species that's been here since the 1880s. They're incredibly abundant, they're very widespread, and what we have now with carp is a situation where they pretty much spread out everywhere, and they live at fairly high densities along with our other native fish. In some areas they might be a problem because they do tend to destroy vegetation, but we have kind of an excess of vegetation in a lot of the areas along the Grand. What they do is they'll root in the bottom, and they'll stir up the water a bit, so sometimes they muddy areas, which can be a problem for some fish. But in other areas, like the main channel of big rivers, they're probably not as much of a big deal as they are in some of the wetlands where they tend to spawn. So these are fish that you really tend to see when it floods. They'll move into those oxbows. And there's a few differences. One, if you have a fish in hand and it has those 4 barbels up by the mouth, then it's a carp, not a sucker. They also have this really stiff dorsal spine, which I've seen people put that right through their hand. It doesn't look that sharp, but it's barbed and it's thick and strong. Suckers don't have that. So carp are actually in the minnow family too. The suckers have their own family. They're actually a family that's unique to the continent. There's only one species that lives in China. The rest of the suckers are native to North America only.